Well, the bear is going bankrupt. While cheaper oil prices have been an early Christmas gift to motorists here in America, in Russia, it's a different story. Their currency has been devalued drastically, and they're desperately trying to stop the bleeding.
Some say that it's all happening because Saudi Arabia is punishing Russia by playing a high-stakes game with oil prices. As George Thomas reports, it's a game with a global impact.
A barrel of oil is now below $60 for the first time since May 2009. Good news for Americans who are actually smiling as they fill up at the pump these days. But halfway around the world, for some of America's adversaries like Iran and Russia, plummeting oil prices has been hurting, and hurting bad. Both need oil prices to be above $100 a barrel to fund large parts of their economies. The result? Russia is imploding. The ruble is in a free fall, down 50% against the dollar. To stop the bleeding, Russia's central bank made a dramatic move today, raising interest rates from 10.5% to a whopping 17%. Add to this the bite of Western sanctions, and the Washington Post says Russia's economy is doomed. In Iran, it's a similar story. Oil is also their lifeline.
The Iranians, psychologically, their most valuable asset is depreciating in value.
The result, its currency dropped 6% against the dollar, and its economy is getting hammered.
If you're an Iranian policy planner and you're planning your budget and you are pegging it at $120 and all of a sudden the price of oil is at 70, in the medium term, you've got some problem.
In the grand bazaars of Tehran, customers and businesses are feeling the pinch.
When the nuclear talks failed to lead to a deal, the exchange rates started to go up. In the last couple of days, I think the decline in oil prices contributed to the rise in exchange rates again.
Both countries in part blame Saudi Arabia for their economic mess. As the world's largest producer and exporter of oil, Saudi Arabia has refused to cut supply and drive prices up. But analysts say the Saudis have an ulterior motive in playing chicken with its oil. They want to punish Iran and Russia. Saudi Arabia and Iran are longtime rivals. The Saudis believe U.S. attempts to stop Iran's nuclear threat are going nowhere, so they are using their most effective weapon to do what Western sanctions couldn't. Iran's president called the Saudi move to keep oil prices low politically motivated. President Hassan Rouhani told members of his cabinet last week that Iran and the people of the region will not forget such conspiracies, or in other words, treachery against the interests of the Muslim world. Meanwhile, Saudi-Russian relations aren't that cozy either. Since the Syrian uprising started in 2011, the Saudis have wanted the Assad regime in Damascus to go, but blame the Russians for propping it. So while Americans enjoy their early Christmas present at the pumps, Russians and Iranians are seething, wondering how long prices will stay low before their economies potentially collapse. George Thomas, CBN News.
Thank you, George. I told you yesterday that the ruble had gone. A year ago, 1 year ago, it was 32 rubles to the dollar. You took a dollar, you bought 32 rubles. If you had 32 rubles, you got $1. And so that was the exchange rate 1 year ago. All right, yesterday, the ruble had fallen to 60, so it took 60 rubles to get $1. Then the bank came in yesterday and said, we've got to do something quick, and so they jacked up interest rates to 17%. Which will kill the Russian economy. It means that businessmen will pay, exorbitant rates to borrow money if they can borrow it at all. And then, but it didn't stop the bleeding. The ruble fall continued, so it's over 70 rubles to $1. Now just imagine if you need oil parts, you've got an oil field, and you have to import American parts. Those value of those parts just went up over 200% or 100%. They're double, essentially, what they have been, more than double. And this is going to kill the Russian economy. It is just a savage blow. Now, what is the takeaway on this? Well, you could have, I was told our producer, I wish I'd shorted the ruble, but I didn't. But nevertheless, I don't think now's the time to get into that maelstrom and try to make money. But I do think this. The wounded bear can be very dangerous. And if I were Putin running that kleptocracy he's in charge of, I think I would make an immediate foreign policy adventure. He's got a huge army. He's got vast supplies of nuclear weapons. He has all the bluff and bluster, and the people apparently now are behind him. They won't be for another few months. If this thing continues into the winter, it's going to be brutal for the Russians. So what does he do? He will focus their attention on a foreign adventure and stand with Mother Russia while we go after those dirty Poles or the Chechens or whatever adversary he decides he wants to aim at. And of course, the first will be the Ukrainians. He's going to say, well, we've got to recapture Ukraine because Ukraine's got a lot of potential wealth, and so he wants to bring it into orbit. We're on the verge of a major shooting war. Don't just rub your hands with glee.
Doesn't he need fuel and a reasonable economy to do that kind of?
Well, he's got fuel. He's got oil. The oil's there. It's his oil, so he's got enough oil to fuel his tanks and his trucks and all that. And so he's got plenty of equipment. But after a while, he's got to start importing things. But right now, he could go to war in the status he's in. The economy will be falling all to pieces. And there's going to be rampant inflation, and probably it'll be depression in Russia. I mean, he's faced with a serious dilemma. We've had sanctions on him, now the stuff from the Saudis on top of it. I don't envy him, but he's a nasty operator, but it's like a cornered rat. They bite and tear, and he's going to bite. You just watch, mark my words, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see a Russian adventure in the next couple of days. Well, whew.
That's a frightening perspective.
Well, it's a frightening perspective, but instead of rejoicing at Christmas, that's what's going to happen. Well, just when you thought you couldn't be any more shocked by Muslim terrorists, the Taliban has done something truly horrific. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington.
That's right, Pat. In Pakistan, Taliban gunmen attacked a school early today, slaughtering scores of students. Police say the gunmen entered the military-run school, shooting at random before Army commandos reached the scene. The terrorists killing more than 120 people, including at least 80 students. Dozens of wounded children are being treated at local hospitals. The Taliban group that claimed responsibility for the attack is trying to overthrow the Pakistani government. A spokesman for the group said 6 suicide bombers carried out the attack in revenge for Taliban members killed by Pakistani authorities. Well, grief and sadness across Australia today in the wake of the shocking standoff that claimed the lives of a gunman and 2 of his hostages. The Islamist gunman has been described as a deeply disturbed person carrying out a sick fantasy. And as Charlene Aaron reports, the siege in Sydney raises questions about attacks by lone wolf terrorists in Australia and around the world.
Mountains of flowers blanket the pavement at Martin Place, where the deadly siege began. Monday, a gunman burst into the Lindt Chocolate Cafe in Sydney and took 17 people inside hostage.
The gunman has been identified as Monharan Monas, an Iranian-born self-proclaimed Islamic sheikh with a long history of violent crime, including the murder of his wife, 22 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and a history of extreme acts, such as sending letters to the family members of Australian soldiers killed in Afghanistan.
The rescue of the hostages unfolded in front of TV cameras. 2 hostages were killed in the melee. Katrina Dawson, a 38-year-old lawyer, and 34-year-old Tori Johnson, the manager of the cafe, who witnesses say died trying to disarm the gunman. During the siege, Monas ordered the hostages to fly a black jihadi flag in the window.
He apparently asked for an ISIS flag, that black Islamic state flag that we've seen flown throughout Syria and Iraq.
Some 150 Aussies have traveled to Syria to join ISIS in recent years, and that Sydney illustrates the rising danger of lone wolf terrorism, and fears have been rising through Australia and the West since the rise of ISIS.
Of course, the jihadists are planning the next 9/11 diligently, but in the meantime, these self-starter, low-tech attacks, these lone wolf, you kind of turn yourself into a one-man jihad.
In September, Australian counterterrorism forces detained 15 people in a series of raids after receiving intelligence that ISIS was planning public beheadings in 2 Australian cities. Also in September, Canadian authorities confirmed the Islamic gunman who attacked Parliament and killed a soldier was motivated by his ideology. There are also radical Muslims in the U.S. One beheaded a co-worker in Oklahoma. Another attacked a New York police officer with a hatchet. While it's unclear how many of these cases involve Muslims with mental illness, they are all examples of lone wolf terrorism that involve undeniable Islamic ideology. Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Pat, these are indeed dangerous times in which we live.
Well, you know, you've got Russia on the one hand, it's a big power that can make a lot of damage, and you've got these little lone wolves running around shooting people. But what's happening in Pakistan to me is very significant because the ISI, the Pakistani secret police, have been in league with the Taliban. They knew precisely where Osama bin Laden was staying. They knew he was in Abbottabad. They knew that compound where he was housed. They had been covertly helping al-Qaeda over the years, and now that thing's coming back to bite them. And they've been trying to play it both sides. They appear to be our friend, and we give them a great deal of financial aid. And at the same time, they're playing footsie and cozy with the radical Muslims because they want to stay in power. So it's a mess out there. But folks, why won't the administration call what it is, a spade a spade? Why don't they identify Islam? They won't talk about it. They say, well, these are deranged gunmen, or these are this, that. They're Muslim extremists. And they're motivated by an ideology that says that if you can kill some infidels, you'll go to paradise and have 72 virgins looking after you. I mean, it's that crazy mentality that is causing this problem. Now, there are many very peaceful Muslims. They're Muslims in name only, and they say, well, we're Muslim, but they're not radicals. But there are now many hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of radical Muslims. And we have a book. You need to know what it says. It's a book called Islam, Religion of Peace or War. This is an extremely good book on the origins of Islam, about what the Quran has to say, what the Hadith has to say. It is very important, and we'll give this to you free if you just call in, but you need to have it, because this is a tough world we're living in, and these people do not observe the canons of decency, which we know in Western civilization. They're brutal killers, thugs, bandits, murderers, and they are coming here, which we're going to tell you about in a little while. Well, John, what's next?
Pat, Obamacare is undermining a key source of health care for needy Americans. A report in the Wall Street Journal says nearly a dozen free health clinics have closed in the last 2 years, citing the health care law as a major reason. Some clinics have seen a drop in patients, but others are losing donors who believe all uninsured people will now be covered. Other free clinics have actually seen a rise in patients, like people with serious illnesses, such as diabetes, who cannot otherwise afford care and medication. The Congressional Budget Office predicts Obamacare will still leave around 31 million people uninsured. Well, today, first-hand account of what we've been reporting for years, that news organizations often show bias against Israel, and it happened a lot during this summer's war with Hamas. A former reporter with the Associated Press is blowing the whistle. Chris Mitchell has his story from Jerusalem.
During the summer of 2014, Israel and Hamas fought for 50 days. Reporters from all over the globe covered the fighting, often filling their stories with conflicting information and questionable reporting. After the war, former AP reporter Mati Friedman wrote an article called An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth.
And I decided at the end of the summer to write an essay looking at what has gone wrong through the lens of my own experiences.
For 7 years, Friedman reported for the Associated Press, a giant news organization that provides information to many other media outlets around the world. He says the AP and the mainstream press suffer from two malfunctions. One, Israel gets too much coverage, and two, the press has taken sides.
The mainstream press corps here has largely adopted an advocacy role. They've decided to play a political role in the conflict. They've decided to lobby for the side that they think is right, and political decisions are disguised as journalistic decisions.
Friedman says Hamas took advantage of the bias.
The strategy is to terrorize Israeli civilians using rockets, provoke an Israeli response, put civilians in Gaza in between the Israelis and the Hamas fighters by storing rockets in civilian basements, in the basements of mosques, in schools, and we've seen all those things documented this summer, and then having the huge international media contingent in Gaza film the civilian casualties, not the armed men, and use those pictures to spark outrage against Israel abroad, and that will prevent Israel from acting to the full extent of its strength against Hamas. That's the strategy. I think any intelligent person can see it, and yet it's not covered like that.
But the Associated Press refuted Friedman's claim. It issued a statement that said in part, his arguments have been filled with distortions, half-truths, and inaccuracies, both about the recent Gaza war and more distant events. His suggestion of AP bias against Israel is false. The AP denies Friedman's claim that the AP and other media ignored or underreported Hamas firing from mosques, schools, and UN facilities. But Friedman says the world is getting a skewed version of what actually is happening.
The story is, if you read between the lines and if you read the lines themselves, the story is that Israel is faced with a clear moral choice and is making the wrong choice. Israel could have peace, but it chooses war. That story is false.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Pat, he may be a new voice, but this isn't anything that you didn't already know.
Listen, I've run into that outfit for so many years. I think they've sort of cleaned up their act a little bit. They used to be so leftist, it just killed you. I mean, the stories were, you know, I remember in what the Israelis call Operation Northern Galilee, when Israel went up into the area of Lebanon that was controlled by PLO and others. And one of the reporters called up his office in New York and the guy said, well, where are you? And he said, well, I'm sitting in a particular city and I'm having lunch. And the man in New York said, no, you're not. That city has been demolished by the Israelis. And the man said, I'm here in the city having lunch. And the man in New York said, no, you're not. And the story in New York was Israel had destroyed this city in Lebanon, wow. And that was what went out. And it didn't matter if they had a guy on the ground who was eating lunch in a restaurant in peace in that particular city. The story was Israel had destroyed it. And it's unbelievable. I heard on the radio the other day inaccuracies that were in the New York Times covering these various shootings of these, you know, Trayvon Martin was shot by a policeman, not a volunteer. The guy in Staten Island who was choked, he was shot by a policeman, and that was all apparently the New York Times. These guys are else very sloppy or very biased or a little bit of both. But it means that the American people no longer trust the media, and, well, they shouldn't.
It's a case of battling billboards. A digital billboard along Interstate 49 in Arkansas is flashing alternating ads by a church and an atheist group. The American Atheist ad shows a young girl writing Santa Claus that all she wants for Christmas is to miss church because she's too old for fairy tales. Well, that ad inspired a response by Grace Church in Alma. The church raised money to pay for its own ad to appear just seconds later on the same digital billboard. The church's ad reads, questions, doubts, curiosity, all welcome at Grace Church. Well, Exodus, Gods and Kings is easily the top movie at the box office right now. The biblical epic starring Christian Bale as Moses came in #1 over the weekend, earning $24.5 million. But that's a far cry from the $140 million the movie cost to make. Although the movie did take some liberties with the biblical story, actor Christian Bale said he did his best to keep Moses who he was.
Figure that I've ever portrayed in my life, and the most beloved as well. And so, you know, you have to at some point take a leap of faith and recognize that you have to go with your own portrayal.
Bale went on to say that Moses was somebody who was filled with self-doubt, but equally a liberator and a leader. You can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com.